Hi folks, so since I started doing this, these videos for this YouTube channel, I have had countless numbers of people ask me to do videos on zweihanders, or big two-handed swords. I've put it back a little bit and had to think about how to address the topic. I've also put it back slightly because I do not own a large two-handed sword to hold, and as you all know, I like to hold the weapon I'm talking about in these videos. I have owned a large two-handed sword, and I have played with them many times. Friends of mine have them and so on. I sold the one I had because I didn't really use it for much, and I knew someone who would get to use it more often than I did. And I do have plenty of things I can say about them, but it's a fairly large topic, so I'm going to break it down into separate videos, and this is the first part. So the first thing to say is, I'm going to first look at the names that were applied to these weapons and when they were applied, and secondly briefly touch on what they were for, these weapons. Okay, so the first thing is that it's common, I don't know where it comes from, whether it's an internet thing or whether it's from role-playing games or computer games, I don't know, but it seems very, very common to refer to these big two-handed swords, and by that I mean a sword that with its point on the ground comes up to your sort of chest or chin, or even as tall as you, so it's kind of like pole weapon, poleaxe length, okay? It's very common to refer to these as zweihanders. Which is not wrong per se, it's just a German expression that I suppose means two-hander. As for historical sources calling them zweihanders, I'm actually not sure which sources refer to them that. I know that some German sources refer to beidenhander, perhaps, I've heard this used, but I don't personally work with German sources, so I'm not the best person to comment on that. But zweihander, beidenhander essentially means two-hander, or you know, maybe double-hander. And means two-handed sword, large sword. They were known by other names in other countries. In England they were known as two-handed sword, okay, and that's one reason why I get annoyed by English-speaking people, mostly Americans, Brits and Australians and Canadians, referring to them as zweihanders, because we've got English sources calling them two-handed swords, so why say zweihander when you can say two-handed sword? It seems a bit strange. But they were known as two-handed sword in England, also sometimes as great sword, sometimes a war sword, sword of war, which seems to come from the French épée de guerre. And obviously in Scotland there were a couple of expressions which debatably were used for the two-handed sword in Scotland, and it's commonly now known as the Claymore. I won't go into that whole debate about the origin of the word Claymore now. In Spain and Portugal it seems to have been known as the montante, and they had their own style of large two-handed sword. In France it seems to just been the French for two-handed sword, sometimes épée de guerre. In Italy it was either known as spada a due mani, in other words sword of two hands, or spadone, which just means great sword or big sword. So what you find is, it doesn't matter which language you're looking at, you get the same kind of names for them that translated into English either mean big sword or giant sword or great sword, or two-handed sword, quite simple. And whereas these things tend to be known as long swords or hand-and-a-half swords these days, we tend to reserve the name two-handed sword for the really big swords that rely on two hands. So when did they come about? Well, largely speaking, the really big two-handed swords start to appear with some frequency in the mid to late 15th century. Now, that's not to say that there weren't big two-handed sized swords before that. There were. In the 13th and 14th centuries, there are a very few examples of really big two-handed swords. There's one which is attributed to Edward III, which is in Westminster Abbey. There's another one in Arundel Castle, which is unattributed, but it's very similar to the Edward III example. And these are commonly what's called bearing swords. And this is very important to mention in any discussion of these big two-handed swords, because a bearing sword is essentially a ceremonial sword of the Middle Ages and Renaissance that was carried usually in mayoral processions. and many towns and cities in England and France and Spain and Italy and so on had a ceremonial bearing sword, and this was essentially an oversized giant sword. And as far as I know, nobody really knows where the tradition started or when it started or why. But the fact is that by the 14th century, many cities and towns across Western Europe, possibly Eastern Europe, I don't know, had civic, as they're known, civic swords, so that the city or the town owned a large bearing sword. So some of these early examples seem not to have been weapons per se. They seem to have been giant versions of longswords, essentially. So they're proportioned like a longsword, but made really, really big. And it is interesting just to mention at that point that I know that in Japan they have a similar thing, where they have in some temples, they have votive giant katanas, well, like a giant tashi, that are too big to wield, but they're there in the temple, and they were obviously made by a master swordsmith as a sort of offering. And in a way, I suppose it's a similar thing. It's kind of showing that, you know, we can draw on the resources to make a giant sword. It's like a normal sword, but it's massive, okay? So, putting that to one side now, the fighting versions of these two-handed swords, you first seem to see them commonly in art, and you see them in Froissart's Chronicles, for example, from the late 15th century. And they really just look like big long swords, and they seem to have just been used like big long swords. They don't seem to have had, at that point yet, a specific purpose. They were just oversized longswords for someone who thought, I want a really big longsword. I've tried a normal longsword, now I want a really big one. And I have noted over the years, and I've mentioned this in a few forums, and people have either agreed or disagreed with me, that in some of the medieval art, it often looks like you have deployments of lines of infantry. So, for example, you often have people with sword and buckler fighting in the front rank or on the sides, on the flanks, and often people with polearms in the middle. And often what you see, polearms I mean more thrusting polearms like spears and pikes, or just bills and halberds, but using the point. And then often you see at the back rank people with things like pole hammers, pole axes, sometimes halberds, or a spiky ball on a long stick, like a morning star on a long pole, or indeed these big two-handed swords. You often see them at the back swinging the thing over the heads of their compatriots, of their comrades in front of them. So it does seem like at the early stage the large swords were kind of like perhaps the more knightly version of a polearm. They were just like the alternative to a poleaxe, because obviously they would have been expensive, so a common soldier wouldn't have been able to afford a giant sword, but someone who wanted to fight in the ranks maybe with a longer weapon and do this kind of sniping enemy soldiers' heads over using the reach to reach over his own fellows' heads and sort of hit over, instead of using a cheap-ass polearm like a bill or something, thought I'll have a giant sword. So potentially that's one of the purposes of them early on, or just simply a big alternative to a longsword. However, by the time we get to the 16th century, what we find is that these big two-handed swords are essentially being used in the same roles as any other sword is, really. They seem to have been used as, by Landsknechts, for example, as just a type of weapon, like instead of a halberd or instead of a sword and shield, they'd carry a big two-handed sword instead. So it seems to have been just another weapon that you could choose to use on the battlefield. And they don't seem to have necessarily had a particular tactical role. However, again we come back to this topic of pike blocks, and are they an anti-pike weapon? Well, as far as I know, there's no hard and fast evidence for the big 16th century two-handed swords being used specifically as anti-pike weapons. However, the people using halberds and bills in the 16th century were themselves, to a degree, anti-pike troops. So it was quite common for the English and certain German mercenaries like the Landsknechts and so on to deploy these types of troops using longish chopping weapons or cut and thrust weapons against pike blocks, it seems. And it's sort of almost an antidote maybe to a pike block, or a way of attacking the pike block effectively. And it does seem that these big two-handed swords were perhaps used, mixed up with halberds and bills and these kind of chopping, cut and thrust pole weapons. So potentially in that. The only really hard piece of evidence I know of large-ish two-handed swords being used against a pike specifically is actually in Marozzo. If you look in the 1536 version of Opera Nova by Achille Marozzo, which can be found online, you can actually see he's in a special guard position, which is called Guardia Contra Haste, I think, which means guard against haste. Means a hafted weapon, shafted weapon, pole weapon, in other words. And actually you see him standing in this guard, and on the ground are the chopped up pieces of a pike or a spear. Okay, so that's the only hard piece of evidence I know of to imply that maybe these largest two-handed swords were used for that purpose. But there is another very important purpose of these big two-handed swords, and that is that they were often carried by bodyguards or people holding a position. So for example, if you look at the Iberian, i.e. Spanish and Portuguese, montante material, it consists mostly of continuous sort of swirling movements, moulinettes going around, and steps and so on, that seem to be with the purpose of holding ground and fighting multiple opponents. I believe there are historical examples of people holding passages and bridges and doorways and things like this with these large two-handed swords, because if you've got a bunch of guys coming at you with maybe pole weapons or short, normal sized swords, one-handed swords, or sword and buckler, sword and shield, whatever, if you have a really big ass sword and indeed a big halberd or a bill or something like that, and you can keep swinging it around at your opponents, you can essentially keep them at bay. You might not be able to beat them necessarily, but you can keep them away. And it does seem that this was perhaps a purpose of the two-handed sword in the 16th century as well. And this comes back to perhaps the reason why two-handed swords are carried with processions in cities and towns. Because perhaps originally the guy with the big sword, or indeed the big mace, and maces are very important in that role as well, was perhaps a bodyguard of the mayor or one of the other civic officials. So there we go. I've covered, first of all, there's a variety of names for the two-handed sword. It was particularly popular from really the end of the 15th century, but then really in the 16th century it seems to have come into its own. There are various designs. There are Spanish types, there are Italian types, German types, and indeed English types. And it seems to have filled a variety of roles. It wasn't just for taking on pikes, but it may have been involved in the tactical or strategic way of taking on pikes. But it was also used by bodyguards and people holding a position, and indeed, essentially, it was used in many of the roles that many other large weapons like halberds and bills were also used in. Okay, I'll talk some more about two-handed swords in the future. Cheers.